Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're stepping beyond maybe the most familiar idea in neuroscience.
hmm
We're looking past the single neuron, that sort of traditional building block, to ask this really huge question. How does all that coordinated activity in the brain actually produce, behavior?
Yeah, it's a really fundamental shift, isn't it? Because for, gosh, over a century, really since Ramon y Cajal's foundational work, we've had the neuron doctrine.
Right. The neuron as the basic computational unit.
Exactly. The idea was you track one neuron, figure out what it does, correlate it with some task, and, well, eventually piece together the whole picture.
And look, that gave us so much essential knowledge, absolutely. But it often felt like something was missing when you tried to explain really complex stuff.
Mm.
Like, why do you reach for that cup, not the other one? How do you switch tasks on a dime? Just looking at individual neurons, even thousands of them separately, it felt like. I don't know, trying to understand a novel by looking at random letters.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah, because behavior isn't just adding up what single neurons do. It's something that emerges from how they coordinate, how they work together.
Okay.
And now, with technology allowing us to record from, thousands of neurons at once, we see something really surprising when we map out all that activity.
What's that?
Even though you have this huge potential space of activity, thousands of dimensions, if you record thousands of neurons, the actual patterns the brain uses live in a much simpler, lower dimensional structure.
Hang on. So if you have 1,000 neurons, mathematically, you've got this, like, thousand-dimensional space of possibilities, right?
Yeah.
A massive potential activity playground.
Yep.
And you're saying the brain just ignores most of it. It sticks to a tiny corner.
That's pretty much it. It seems the brain operates under some really powerful constraints. It only explores a very specific, limited set of collective activity patterns. And this operational space, this structure that defines the limits and possibilities, that's what we're calling the neural manifold.
Okay, neural manifold. It sounds, well, honestly, pretty mathematical and abstract. Can we make that more concrete? What is this thing conceptually?
Okay, let's try the classic analogy. Forget the formal definition for just a second. Think about the Earth.
All right.
Globally, we know it's a sphere, it's curved, right? Three-dimensional object in space. But if you just look down at the ground where you're standing,
It looks flat. Yeah, locally flat.
that's the basic idea of a manifold. It's something that might be complex or curved overall, but if you zoom in close enough, locally, it looks simpler, more like flat Euclidean space. So in brain terms, the neural manifold is the mathematical description of all the possible collective states a group of neurons can actually adopt.
Okay.
It represents all the coordinated firing patterns that population can produce, given its built-in limitations.
So back to the 1,000 neurons example, we've got this thousand-dimensional neural state space. Any single moment in time, the combined activity of all those neurons is just one point in that huge space. And as, say, an animal does something, makes a decision, moves its arm, that point traces a path, a trajectory through the space.
Yep.
The big hypothesis here is that this trajectory isn't just randomly wandering around that thousand-dimensional space. It's actually stuck or confined to the surface of this lower dimensional thing, the manifold.
That's the core idea.
Yeah.
The manifold is like the allowed surface, and these underlying constraints keep the brain's activity from just flying off into all those theoretically possible but unused states.
Okay, this feels like a really important point, but also where the details get tricky. The source material really stresses that we need to be super careful about how we measure the size or dimension of this manifold. It mentions 3 different types of dimensionality.
Ah, yes, this is absolutely critical. Getting these mixed up really muddies the water. So let's try another analogy. Imagine you've got a piece of wire, maybe like a single twisty highway ramp, and it's all coiled up inside a giant warehouse.
Okay, warehouse, twisty wire inside. The wire is the manifold.
The wire is the manifold. So first dimension, 1, ambient dimensionality, M. This is just the size of the warehouse itself, all the space available. In the brain context, it's simply the number of neurons you manage to record. Let's say it's 1,000 neurons, so N on 1,000.
Got it. That's the total recording capacity.
Second, 2, intrinsic dimensionality, D. Now think about the wire itself. How many numbers do you really need to describe any point on that wire? For a simple wire, even a twisty one, you just need one number. How far along the wire you are.
Right, like a mile marker on the highway ramp.
Exactly. So even though that ramp might curve through 3 dimensions of space in the warehouse, its intrinsic dimension, D, is just 1. In the brain, this number is often surprisingly maybe less than 20, even if you recorded hundreds or thousands of neurons. It's the minimum number of control knobs needed to specify the state on the manifold.
Okay, ambient is the container, intrinsic is the real substance of the thing itself. What about the third one? Embedding dimensionality. M, this one feels less intuitive.
It is a bit trickier. Embedding dimensionality, M, is the minimum number of warehouse dimensions, sort of the orthogonal axes of the space, that you need to fully describe the manifold without it intersecting itself. If your wire, your manifold, happens to lie perfectly flat on the warehouse floor.
Then you'd only need two dimensions, like length and width, to describe it. M would be 2.
Right, or maybe even just one if it's a straight line. In that flat case, M might equal D. But what if that wire ramp is really complexly coiled and twisted, going up and down and looping around?
Ah, then even though the wire itself is still intrinsically 1D, just distance along it, you might need all 3 dimensions of the warehouse length, width, height, to properly show how it twists and turns in that space without bumping into itself.
Precisely. So you could have a low intrinsic dimension D1, but require a much higher embedding dimension, say M3, because the manifold is highly curved or nonlinear.
And that's why simple linear methods like the PCA you often hear about can fail us here.
Yes, exactly. PCA, principal component analysis, basically tries to find the best flat plane or hyperplane that captures the most variance in the data. If your real manifold is that coiled wire, PCA will just give you a flat shadow of it, missing all the crucial twists and turns.
So it misses the actual constraints, which means we need, what, more sophisticated math tools.
Yeah, we need nonlinear manifold learning techniques, things like isomap, UMP-MP, LTSA. These algorithms are designed specifically to respect the underlying geometry. They try to preserve things like the true distance between points along the manifold surface, not just the straight line distance through the warehouse space. They can uncover those complex, non-flat shapes, like the classic Swiss roll example you see in textbooks.
Okay, that makes sense. We need tools that can see the curves. So we know these low-dimensional manifolds exist, these constraints. But what creates them? What are the biological forces at play? Figure 1a in the source mentions 2 main types.
Right, the first is probably what comes to mind immediately, the biophysical constraints.
The actual hardware.
Yeah, the nuts and bolts, the direct synaptic connections between neurons, the more complex multisynaptic pathways, how glial cells might influence things, the soup of neuromodulators washing over the circuits, even slower changes in synapses or membranes. Basically, the physical wiring and the rules of how neurons talk to each other. This dictates the fundamental ways they can coordinate.
Okay, that's the built-in structure. What's the other force?
The second is behavioral constraints.
Yeah.
This is about what the animal is actually doing at the moment. Reaching for that coffee cup, navigating a maze, making a choice. The specific task sculpts which part of the much larger, potentially available manifold is actually being explored or activated right now.
Yeah, so the biophysics defines the whole possible menu of brain states, the manifold, and the current behavior is like choosing a specific dish from that menu for today's meal.
That's a perfect analogy.
Okay, let's synthesize this bit. We've got this idea that brain activity, despite involving thousands of neurons, is restricted to a low-dimensional surface, the manifold, shaped by both the physical wiring and the ongoing behavior. If this manifold represents such a powerful set of constraints, the big question then is, does it limit what we can learn? Can the brain only easily learn things that sort of fit onto its existing manifold?
This leads us directly to some really compelling evidence, particularly the BCI, brain-computer interface learning studies, like the one by Sattler and colleagues. It's become quite foundational.
Right, the experiments with monkeys controlling cursors with their brain activity.
Exactly. They recorded activity from the motor cortex and established a baseline mapping. Certain patterns of neural activity, these latent trajectories on the manifold, corresponded to moving the cursor in specific directions and speeds.
Okay, so they had a working system, then they started messing with it.
Yes, that was the key. They introduced perturbations to this mapping to see how easily the monkeys could adapt. And they designed 2 specific types of changes. First, within manifold perturbation, meaning they changed the rules of the cursor control, but in a way that the new required neural patterns were still one that the monkey's brain already naturally produced. They were still patterns lying on the existing manifold, just maybe repurposed for a different cursor movement. Essentially, using an existing coordination pattern in a new way.
And how did the monkeys do with that?
They learned relatively quickly. It seemed the brain could readily reassociate these existing patterns with new outcomes. It was like learning to use a familiar tool for a slightly different job.
Okay, makes sense. But then came the challenging part.
Then came the outside manifold perturbations. Here, The new mapping required the monkeys to generate neural coordination patterns. They were fundamentally new patterns that did not lie on the original manifold, patterns that the existing circuit constraints actively prevented or made difficult.
So, asking the brain to do something truly novel, coordination-wise, what happened then?
That was much harder. It took extensive training. Sometimes the monkeys couldn't learn it at all within the experiment's time frame.
Wow.
It strongly suggested that learning these outside mappings required the brain to physically change its underlying circuitry, to actually reshape the manifold itself through plasticity, to accommodate this entirely new way of coordinating its neurons. The existing manifold wasn't just a suggestion, it was a real barrier to learning.
That clicks with so much human experience, doesn't it? Why learning, say, a completely new language with different tones as an adult is so hard, or mastering a really complex sport. It's not just practice. You might be fighting against the brain's ingrained map of possibilities. You have to literally carve out new paths.
Absolutely. It's about reshaping those constraints. And the evidence gets even cooler when we look at specific shapes of manifolds that seem tailor-made for particular functions. This is where the geometry really comes alive.
Oh, yeah, let's talk shapes. These are great mental images. What did they find?
Well, one of the clearest examples is the ring attractor. Imagine the possible states of the neural population are constrained to lie on a simple circle, like a ring.
Okay.
This structure pops up again and again in head direction cells. These are neurons that act like the brain's internal compass, signaling which way the head is pointing. Found in places like the thalamus in mice, the hindbrain in zebrafish.
A closed loop, like a circle, makes perfect sense for tracking something continuous and periodic, like 360 degrees of direction.
Exactly. And what's truly amazing is that studies have shown this ring structure, this circular constraint on activity, persists even when the animal is asleep.
Whoa, really? So it's not just tied to the act of navigating.
Nope. It suggests it's a deeply embedded, fundamental property of the circuit, likely established through development and evolution, ensuring this core function of orientation tracking is always available, always constrained in this efficient way.
That's incredible. Okay, so a ring for direction, what's another shape? Is there more complex geometry?
Definitely. The next step up in complexity might be the toroidal manifold. Think donut shape.
A torus, okay. Where do we see that?
This geometry has been strongly associated with grid cells, particularly in the medial entorhinal cortex, an area critical for spatial navigation.
Grid cells. Those are the ones that fire in those amazing hexagonal patterns as an animal explores, right? Creating a sort of internal map.
That's them. And a toroidal structure, which topologically is like the surface of a donut, provides a natural way to represent two independent periodic variables simultaneously. Think about mapping coordinates on a 2D surface. The torus geometry seems beautifully suited for constructing that kind of spatial representation.
So again, the geometry of the manifold seems to directly reflect the geometry of the problem. The brain is solving tracking direction on a ring, mapping space on a torus.
Precisely. And we even see this connection to the external world directly. Remember the behavioral constraints we mentioned?
Yeah.
There's work showing that in the hippocampus, another key memory and navigation area, specifically CA1, the shape of the estimated neural manifold actually mirrored the geometry of the physical enclosure the mouse was exploring.
You're kidding. So if the box was square, the manifold looked squarish.
Essentially, yes. The structure of the neural activity constraints was actively shaped by the specific behavioral context, by the geometry of the world being experienced.
Okay, that really drives home how dynamic these things are. They're not just fixed wiring diagrams. Which brings us to the different time scales over which these manifolds get shaped. Figure 4 in the source material lays this out nicely.
Right, it proposes three main timescales. The fastest is learning. On this timescale, day to day or minute to minute, most learning probably involves just exploring different regions of the existing manifold, finding new ways to use the current menu.
Like the within manifold BCI task.
Exactly. But as we saw with the outside manifold task, learning truly novel or difficult skills likely requires plasticity mechanisms to kick in and actually modify the shape of the manifold itself. That takes more time and effort.
Then you have the longer timescales, development and evolution. These must be setting the stage, right? Defining the initial landscape.
Precisely. Development is where the basic circuits get built according to the genetic program, establishing the fundamental properties and constraints. Evolution, over vast timescales, selects for circuit designs that produce useful manifolds. Maybe that's why we see conserved structures like the ring attractor across different species. It's a good solution that evolution keeps finding.
This leads to a really deep, almost philosophical point. The material raises the chicken or the egg problem. What comes first? The manifold, this structure of constraints and geometry, or the neural dynamics, the actual activity patterns and trajectories that race across it?
It's a classic conundrum in systems like this. Right now, experimentally, we usually observe the dynamics first. We record the neural activity, the trajectories.
And then we use math to infer the shape of the manifold they seem to be stuck to. We estimate it post hoc.
Right. But the whole theory starts with the idea that the manifold causes or constrains the dynamics. It dictates where the activity can go.
But then, activity itself, through learning and development, especially activity-dependent plasticity, must be constantly shaping and reshaping the manifold.
Exactly. They're completely intertwined. The manifold constrains the dynamics, but the dynamics, over time, sculpt the manifold. You can't really separate them. They're, as the paper says, inextricably linked. Understanding one fully requires understanding the other.
So if they're so linked, why focus on the manifold level? Does this abstract geometric description actually give us more explanatory power than just looking at, say, all the individual synaptic connections or neuron firing rates?
That's the crucial question. The argument is yes, it often does because of emergence. It's like that saying, more is different. Think about the movie analogy again. If I wanted to explain the movie, telling you the plot, the high-level structure, the narrative arc, the manifold of the story, is far more informative and compact than describing the pixel colors in every single one of the million frames.
Right. The plot is the meaningful level. The individual frames are the low-level details.
Then crucially, you can change a lot of the low-level details without changing the essential plot. Think about classic experiments. Even in simpler systems like the lobster's domatogastric ganglion, it's this little cluster of neurons that controls their digestion, a workhorse for studying rhythmic circuits.
Okay.
Researchers found that you could have vastly different sets of underlying parameters, different strengths of connections, different ion channel densities in the neurons, a huge variety of low-level states.
And they could all produce the exact same rhythmic output pattern.
Yeah.
The same functional behavior.
Exactly. The same high-level dynamics, the same manifold of activity emerge from many different low-level configurations. Similar things have been seen in C. elegans recordings, too.
So, if multiple different low-level setups can achieve the same functional outcome, the same high-level pattern, then that high-level pattern, the manifold, is arguably the more fundamental, more apt level for understanding what the system is actually doing for behavior.
That's the core argument. It captures the essential computation while abstracting away from the potentially messy, variable implementation details.
Okay, this framework isn't just about observing and explaining then. It points towards intervention, towards actively engaging with this manifold structure.
Absolutely. The ultimate goal, outlined nicely in Figure 5 of the source, is to move towards causal manipulation of these manifold states. It's sort of a three-stage process they envision.
What are the stages?
First, validation. This means using brief perturbations. Can we, say, artificially nudge the neural state off the manifold and watch it snap back? Does it behave like a stable surface? This would confirm the constraints are real and predictable.
Okay, testing the boundaries. What's next?
Second, exploration. Could we develop techniques to gently steer the neural activity to specific points on the manifold? And if we do, does the animal reliably produce the behavior associated with that point on the map?
Using the manifold like a control panel for behavior, ambitious. And the third stage?
Alteration. This is the really long-term challenging goal. It involves engaging plasticity, maybe over longer timescales, to actually change the manifold's shape. The dream scenario involves technologies like closed-loop holographic stimulation,
Wow.
where you could potentially monitor the brain state in real time and project light patterns to precisely activate or silence specific neurons, maybe to teleport the activity state to a desired location on the manifold, or even gradually reshape the manifold itself.
That sounds like science fiction.
It's definitely futuristic,
Pers-
but it's the direction the field is aiming for. To not just read the Brown's map, but to potentially help rewrite it.
Let's try to pull this all together then. We started with the limits of the single neuron view. We introduced neural manifolds as these low-dimensional structures or surfaces within the high-dimensional space of brain activity. They represent the real constraints on what patterns the brain can easily produce. These constraints come from both the physical wiring, the biophysics, and the demands of ongoing behavior.
Right.
We learned that the geometry of these manifolds isn't just abstract math, it's functionally critical. We saw rings for head direction, tori perhaps for grid cell mapping, and even shapes reflecting the environment in the hippocampus.
Yep, shape matters.
And these manacles aren't static. They're shaped over evolutionary time, laid down during development, and crucially, they can be modified, albeit sometimes with great difficulty, through learning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They provide this compact, interpretable bridge linking the brain's activity to cognition, action, and perception.
So, the final provocative thought, the one that really springs from thinking about causal manipulation. If we can understand the manifold, validate its constraints, maybe even start to steer activity along it.
The big question becomes, how far are we, really, from being able to intentionally design a new manifold? Could we, one day, use these techniques to essentially install a new skill, a new capacity into a brain by directly engineering the required geometrical constraints on its neural activity, giving it an ability that was previously outside its biological reach?
Reshaping the brain's operational menu by redesigning the menu itself. That's a truly profound idea to end on. Thank you. This has been an incredibly insightful deep dive.
My pleasure. It's a fascinating area.